Welcome to the second module of the course on cooperative economy. And now I would like to get into some of the details of cooperative theory that I've outlined in the very first video of the first module. As I suggested, the contribution of the cooperative economy amounts to three main areas. Firstly, democratic theory, then the theory of the firm, and then also theory of cooperatives or theory of cooperation. Now that we've covered all of the basics, some of the literature and the background and sort of the systematic structure, I can get into the actual details of these three approaches. So starting with the first approach, getting into democracy and democratic theory, this will be the very first lecture. So just to see what's on the menu, I am very much interested in a genealogical approach, but before I get to that, I wanted to outline Hubertus Buchstein's four theories of democracy, or four categories of democratic theory. So Buchstein suggests actually that there are four different theories, the first of which being historical, second being empirical, third being formal, and the fourth being normative. So the historical theories of democracy, these are what we know of when reading Plato, Thucydides, others, Edward Gibbon perhaps, and they aim to assess and reconstruct democracy. That's supposed to be temporality, basically placing it in its own historical framework, its own historical context. So reading people in their own time, not in our time. Working on the institutionalization of democracy. How did these historical episodes arise? What were the contexts of the day and the events that led up to the actual formations of democratic political or other structures? And Buchstein argues that these actually serve as an archive at the same time as they serve as an arsenal. And as an archive, they provide basically resources that can be compiled and referred back to at later points. You know, this happened in this case, this happened in that case, and one can always refer back to these historical periods, just as archives store historical documents without really evaluating them. They're just there to browse. At the same time, it provides an arsenal, which is basically more of a useful set of ideas or concepts for actually going back and looking at how to learn from the past. So in order to reform issues or problems with democracy in the present. So these are sorts of course corrections. If we see that the problems that we confront today are similar to problems that faced prior societies, then we can actually learn from how they dealt with these. And that's the arsenal function. So secondly, there are empirical theories, and these aim at classifying democracy or different types of democracy, and they are inductive, so they start with general principles and then move to more specific cases. And they are also descriptive, tracing causal relationships between different modes, events, and currents as they occur. And they're basically there to serve to provide a varieties of democracy approach. So we can see that not every form of democracy has arisen in similar contexts and are not structured the same. So one of the theses of empirical theories of democracy is actually a type of pluralism, where there is not one size that fits all, but different types of models and approaches that refer to different cultures and traditions, and also historical events and, you know, geopolitical or even environmental situations. The third type of democratic theory is the formal theory, and these are, I guess, quite more, as the phrase says, formal, and attempt to basically distill from either empirical events or maybe an author's or an academic's own mind certain axioms, boiling down certain elements to their most basic forms, and then deducing from those practices. So this, again, is the opposite of the inductive approach. You're going from specific cases or specific types of environments or settings, and then drawing general conclusions from those. And Buchstein argues that these serve to challenge actors to deal with democracy and its weaknesses or problems, but are not without their own issues, as he refers to Buchanan's uh, um, theorizing on democracy, among others. Lastly, there are normative theories, and while these do get a bad rap sometimes in academia, where there is a tendency to have a value neutrality or value freeness, Buchstein actually argues that these are very important as they develop persuasive arguments for democracy, and they serve also as critical measures for evaluating the outcomes of democracy. So Buchstein actually suggests that only on the grounds of the normative theory can the definite features and thus the criteria that enable the empirical theory of democracy uh, occur to decide whether folk democracy in China, Islamic democracy in Iran, so to speak, or the led democracy or directed democracy of Russia can be considered within the group of democratic countries or not. So it is in the background of democratic theory, normative democratic theory, that we can decide whether the authors of certain topics can explain themselves with relation to. So in addition to Buchstein's theories, or framing actually of theories, again, this is a genealogical approach to democracy. The genealogical approach to science has been developed by Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, and further outlined by people like Michel Foucault. Without going into the nitty-gritty of genealogy, I wanted to read this longer quote from Nietzsche's major work in that field, which is on the genealogy of morals. So Genealogie der Moral, written, I think, in the 1870s, 73 perhaps. Don't quote me on that. And he says here, the cause of the origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment and place in a system of purposes, lie worlds apart. Whatever exists, having somehow come into being, is again and again reinterpreted to new ends, taken over, transformed, and redirected by some power superior to it. All events in the organic world are subduing, becoming master, and all subduing and becoming master involves a fresh interpretation, an adjustment through which any previous meaning and purpose are necessarily obscured or even obliterated. However well one has understood the utility of a physiological organ or of a legal institution, a social custom, a political usage, a form of art, or in a religious cult, this means nothing regarding its origin. Purposes and utilities are only signs that a will to power has become master of something less powerful and imposed upon it the character of a function. And the entire history of a thing, an organ, a custom, can in this way be a continuous sign chain of ever new interpretations and adaptations whose causes do not even have to be related to one another, but on the contrary, in some cases succeed and alternate with one another in purely chance fashion. The evolution of a thing, says Nietzsche, a custom, an organ, is thus by no means its progresses towards a goal, or even less, a logical progresses by the shortest route and with the smallest expenditure of force, but the succession of more or less profound, more or less mutually independent processes of subduing, plus the resistances they encounter, the attempts at transformation for the purpose of defense and reaction, and the results of successful counteractions. The form is fluid, but the meaning is even more so. So this is a very, very rich, very dense aphorism of Nietzsche here, very early on in the genealogy, that I think has a sort of a germ of many more sciences even. One can read, among others, notions of cybernetics here, Gregory Bateson with his notion of schismogenesis, many other very fascinating concepts. But the main point, of course, being that, and there are many others as well, one could emphasize, that history is not a linear progression from one era, say primitive, barbaric, to savage, to civilized, but rather there are many contingencies that depend on what forces are, and some of these can be ideas, are dominant in a certain time. So when we look at trace back the history of democracy, we should avoid looking at the history of democracy as one of progressively more democratic traditions. So there are setbacks, there are course corrections, there are many branching diversities of practices and institutions. So it's important to be aware of that, and that's something that I have tried to cover in the third chapter of the Cooperative Economy, which of course in itself is not an exhaustive study or an attempt at a genealogy of democracy, and I hope I do inspire more authors. So before continuing, just one last element of the methodologies here. There are three authors that I have wanted to bring to the attention of a broader audience. I will start with actually Otto Van Dierke, so I will go historically, I suppose. On the left here, who developed the idea of history not as a struggle of classes, but rather as a struggle over forms of association. So for him, the notions of Herrschaft, which is domination, and Genossenschaft, which is cooperation, are the two most prominent logics that can continually be seen to contest with each other throughout history. And Gierke places focus on German society and German history, but one could very much make a study of these contesting logics in any society, in any culture. And one of his main observations, of course, on which this rests, is these differing notions of rights. He's often compared traditional German or Germanic law over the course of its development with Roman law, with respect to the notion of rights, the ontology of rights, if you will, in a philosophical sense. So in German law, he found that rights are never unlimited. So there's always a reverse side of the coin. There's no right without duty is a quote that is attributed to Gierke. And this is different from Roman law, which we will get into in a later lecture, where basically a right is an absolute privilege over something that is only limited by an explicit right or privilege of someone else, which could be manifest in power. It's very different in the German tradition, and again, this contest of domination and cooperation forms Herrschaft, and Genossenschaft forms a central conduit or central framework in his writing. Secondly, John Dewey, who actually was familiar with Otto von Dierke through his English translator, the British legal historian Maitland, who wrote extensively on public policy and public philosophy, and in fact felt that philosophy was no use if it wasn't practiced in public. Dewey was one of the founders of the pragmatic movement of philosophy, and very much influenced by others like Charles Sanders Peirce. And he distinguished not only between notions of public and private, but also between notions of the social versus the individual, and basically suggested that one can develop social ends and social goals both in the form of states, but also via private institutions. So these two poles or axes are quite distinct, and so one should not confuse the two. So social is not to be opposed with private, and vice versa. Also, he suggested going from a great community, or rather from going from the public to a great community. And this entailed for Dewey balancing the problems of the public with the problems of the community. And in fact, Dewey suggested that regarded as an idea, democracy is not an alternative to other principles of associated life. It is the idea of community itself. It is an ideal in the only intelligible sense of an ideal, namely the tendency and movement of something which exists carried to its final limit, viewed as completed, perfected. Thus, for Dewey, democracy in this sense is not a fact and never will be. That this ideal needs only to be realized consciously, not in pure reactive sense, is the fruition of a Deweyan notion of democracy, again, which involves balancing group and private interests. Thus, for Dewey, the problems of democracy in fact require not less but more democracy. So we need to practice more democracy in order to overcome any challenges that arise as a result of conflicts and consternations. And lastly, the individual you see in the middle of the frame here is a Greek-French economist, psychiatrist, polymath named Cornelius Castoriadis, who very frequently discussed the role of the imaginary in social settings, and in fact contested the notion of a natura naturata with a natura naturans, basically suggesting that in Greek society one saw the former, whereas in other societies, arcane societies such as Persia, one saw the latter. So a natura naturans is one that is developed as a process, and a natura naturata is a product that is taken as, say, ready-made. So Dierke, in fact, contrasted the notion of autonomy, both as an individual and a collective phenomenon, with heteronomy. And this can be seen, of course, as a very similar concept as Otto Van Dierke's contrast of domination and cooperation. And I haven't put them here without reason. So Castoriadis suggests that in Greece we encounter the first example of a community explicitly deliberating on the subject of the laws and changing its laws. Elsewhere, laws are a heritage of the ancestors or given by God, otherwise by the one true God, but they are not considered to be established, meaning they are not considered to be created by people as a result of a confrontation and a collective discussion about good and bad laws. And of course, he suggests this notion of a nature as creation created within Greek society the basis on which politics and philosophy developed. So having said that, I'd now like to get into some of the empirical reflections in Chapter 3 of the Cooperative Economy, beginning with the archaeological or prehistorical record. And this is one of, in fact, one can see in Greece where this journey begins, there is, in fact, problems of inequality leading to collapse. And in fact, we see climetrics turning up results such as the differential height, where in fact you do see that significant differences between the aristocracy in Mycenaean palatial cities and the commoners. I think 6 centimeters of difference in height was one that was cited by Levitt. And so there are theories that suggest that one of the contributors to the collapse of Mycenaean civilization was not just foreign invaders, but in fact a unsustainable or unsustainable level of inequality. Levitt suggests that scholars usually ignore dynamic system positive feedback, economic and hence fiscal weaknesses due to administrative and political mismanagement caused by depletion of military budgets and military weaknesses. This induced barbarian invasions, which led to loss of territory and therefore smaller tax base, further reductions in military finances, further military frailty, and yet more invasions until civilizations like the Mycenaean was dismembered. But extreme inequality, popular alienation from the elite, and from the state also had a role. Scholars today are partly in agreement that due to the crisis and collapse of Mycenaean civilization, there were also opportunities for new types of collective endeavors to rise and spread. And so one of these theses suggests that the collapse of Mycenae actually required self-defense on the part of citizen farmers um, who initially themselves had no rights, political rights, that later, again, this situation was considered unsustainable and led to the spread of democracy through hoplite warfare. And on the right here, there's a picture of some burial urns found on the island of Paros, dating back to the early 7th century BC, so before our time, that do depict the use of hoplon shields and suggest an earlier spread of hoplite warfare than has previously been suggested, leading to the conclusion that this type of social innovation did spread much more quickly and was connected to the rise of democracy, democratic poli. And lastly, there is the Indigenous Critique, a recent book, of course, by David Graeber and David Wengrow, the late David Graeber, has suggested that ancient egalitarian megacities in Ukraine and Moldova, circa for the 4th millennia to the 3rd millennia before our time, did feature decentralized or egalitarian structures. These have been called the Cucatini Tripoli cultures. Thus, as opposed to either the Hobbesian or Rousseauian states of nature, much experimentation, it can be argued, took place in ancient societies. Wengrow and Graeber also discuss the cases of the Taosi in ancient China, the Incas, and the Wendat tribes of North America. Moving on, so getting to Greece. One of the things we should mention when discussing Athenian democracy or Greek democracy, we do talk more about Athenian democracy because it's something we know more about than any other, as there are more historical records that are available. We should talk about the rediscovery, the Renaissance, and the reimagination of these concepts. And the rediscovery is attributed to the fact that for millennia, we actually had no direct knowledge as to how Athenian democracy or other Greek democracies functioned. And in fact, we knew more about the Spartan societies than others, and many historical writers were very much enamored by Sparta and saw it as an example of stability rather than Athens. This changed in the course of the 19th century, partly due to the archaeological excavations of Heinrich Schliemann and his very much active media exposés and his about his discoveries, which again rekindled interest in both Homeric civilization, the heroic civilization of the city of Troy and Mycenae, but also in Athenian culture and history. So shortly after Schliemann's most active period in the late 1870s, the Athenian Constitution, as it is called, or the Athenaeon Politeia, a document that was recorded in Aristotle's Lyceum, was discovered on the back of actually some bills of a Roman citizen in the vaults of the British Museum in the year of 1881. And it was actually only after this point that we began to learn again of the details of Athenian democracy. So it's actually been very recent that we even recovered our knowledge of Athenian democracy. So the renaissance of democratic theory or interest in or practices rather is in fact also partly attributable to, as I mentioned, the fact that many historical authors that did survive were not very fond of democracy. And I'm thinking here of Plato, Herodotus, Thucydides, and many others who one can consider at best ambivalent towards democracy. And of course, Plato was a fervent opponent, and actually, in fact, quite politically reactionary. And these authors quite successfully colored many scholars' impressions of the democratic practices of the past. Of course, they emphasized the problems rather than the benefits. And so it's left to authors of the late 19th and 20th centuries and our own current era to reimagine democratic practices in light of new information. And so that's why I'm very much interested in authors like Castoriadis with his notions of autopoiesis and the imaginary. Getting into the actual reforms that led to the rise of Greek democracy, in the middle of the page you see here Solon, who was a Athenian statesman, nobleman and statesman of the 6th century, who was elected archon in a time of great infighting between various sections of the aristocracy. There were many issues of debt bondage. And basically, Solon entered the fray in this period, was entrusted with reforming the institutions of the state, and enacted a number of reforms, including the shaking off of burdens, what it was known to be at the time. Was a debt cancellation. He also ended loans on the security of the person. So this was what eventually led to debt bondage. So he did not just engage in a debt cancellation, but also stop the practices that led to debt bondage. In addition to this, he granted permission for anyone who wished to seek retribution for those who were injured, and also extended the right of appeal to the jury courts, which to that point were only available to the aristocracy. And these last two reforms were actually quite radical, and also extended political participation to lower echelons of Athenian society, who to that point had been excluded. He also reduced some of the property holding requirements for elected office, which opened those offices to all property holders. Thus, as Rhodes suggests, P.J. Rhodes, Solon had ended the monopoly of offices by the well-born, opening it to all who satisfy the property requirement. And one of the most interesting reforms was called the Law of Denunciation, which suggested that if the city was torn by strife, anyone should refuse to place his arms at the disposal of either side should be outlawed and should have no shares in the benefits of the city. So this was an early form of ostracism. So after Solon's reforms were put in place, he more or less retired from politics and became a private citizen, but saw that the result was not satisfactory. Particularly, was not satisfactory to the aristocracy because they believed that he had gone far too far in reforms towards the commoners, who, on the other hand, thought he didn't go far enough. So there followed a period of instability, which allowed a usurper in the name of Pisistratus to take over. He and his sons ruled Athens for around 37 years. And it was only after Kleisthen then gained power in the later 6th century that a modicum of peace was returned to the polity. So who was Kleisthen? He actually, and not Solon, was mostly considered to be the father of Greek democracy, or Athenian democracy at least, with Solon being an innovator who paved the way. So Kleisthen was from a noble family who actually sat on the area pages for Pagus for most of the history of Athens. And he lived in the late 6th century, was a statesman, and he was elected archon. And actually, he ruled in a time, again, as did Solon, of conflict and strife. In this case, again, there were two factions of the aristocracy, one who backed actually Izagoras, his great opponent, and another backed Kleisthenus himself. Kleisthenus was on the losing side, and Izagoras, in fact, was consolidating the aristocracy behind himself. And Thus, Kleisthen is actually engaged in some quite, one might say, opportunistic appeals to commoners. This allowed him to retain power and engage in a series of very fundamental reforms. So just very briefly, he reorganized Athens into 10 demes, whereas before it had been 4. He increased the size of the council from 4 to 500, and he made archons to be selected by lot. To go into more detail, his reforms continued with the dividing of the land of Attica by demes into 3 parts. He called these parts thirds and allotted to 3 to each tribe in such a way that each tribe should have a share in the regions. His more radical reforms involved such reorganizations as breaking apart older ingrained clan-based allegiances. For instance, he made the men living in each deme follow a fellow demesman of one another, so that they should not use their fathers' names, and made it obvious who were the new and who were the old citizens through the reforms, but should be named after their demes. So there was a lot of political reform in this sense, creating a new polity to reflect the new values that were attempting at least to be instilled. So he promoted the standing of these demes, supplanting their role in the place of the older communities like the Naukaria. Additionally, Kleisthen has imposed oaths on the Council of 500 and introduced the practice of ostracism, which was initially designed to marginalize supporters of the tyrant Satrietus, and eventually Athenians took to removing anyone who seemed too powerful. And additionally, for the first time since the tyranny, the 9 archons were, as I said, appointed by lot on a tribal basis from a short list of 500 elected members of the demes, and all of the archons before had been elected. So again, we see as the rise of democracy occurs in Athens, there is in fact a move away from elections and towards selection by lot. Moving on some generations, we get to Pericles, who ruled as archon in what has been considered the golden age of democracy. So he was a leading 5th century statesman, also nobleman, also elected archon, and the situation at the time was not ideal. It was in the midst of the Peloponnese War, which of course dragged on for many, many years. I think it was in total about 40 years. This war continued and drained much of the resources of the city, so there was low morale. And his famed funeral oration, of course, as I mentioned in my very first initial lectures, can be considered a founding document of democratic theory. And in fact, Harris distinguishes between 3 aspects of governance, which Pericles praises in his oration: the deliberative, the magistrates, and the judiciary. And firstly, Pericles praises the deliberative nature of Athenian political institutions, outlining the management of affairs is not in the hands of the few, but in the hands of the many. That is, access to the deliberative institutions is widespread. Moreover, in the same vein, Pericles praises equality before the law for all. And the second, referring to the magistrates, is for Harris the concern for the judiciary aspect of Athenian democratic institutions, which of course were elected by lot as well, so open to all to participate in and adjudicate cases. Thirdly, Pericles compares Athens favorably with Sparta, in that when selecting magistrates, the Athenians do not pick candidates from one side of society, but so the rich, so to speak, the aristocracy, but in accordance with merit. Moreover, Pericles continues, since the Athenians do not enforce a property qualification for magistracies, a man who is able to do some good for the community is not barred from office simply because lack of wealth has prevented him from displaying his worth. So Pericles can be considered one of the pinnacles of and the products of Athenian democratic institutions. So now to get to some of the more contemplative or discursive aspects, This, of course, in the middle here is Moses Finley, one of the famed historians of ancient Greece and Rome. He remarks on some of the paradoxes or tensions in Greek or Athenian society, saying, for instance, that citizenship was a lever on which all else pivoted on in classical Greece. But for the study of Greek economy, says Finley, the distinction of the most far-reaching significance, one that continued right through the classical period in both democratic and oligarchic states, was between the citizen and the non-citizen, because it was a universal rule, he knew of no exception, that ownership of land was an exclusive prerogative of citizens. And of course, there was also a process of collective or social psychology, so that democracy was not just done by fiat or by legal or judicial reforms, but also had to be accepted by the citizenship. So there is the real democratic education occurs of the Athenians in the broadest sense of the word was more amorphous and insidious, involving a remarkable transformation, argues Hansen, one of the most famed scholars of ancient Greece, classicists. It involved a remarkable transformation in the thought of the traditional polis dweller himself. It also involved a balancing of wealthy and poor citizen interest, and it tended towards centrality. I should also mention, before continuing on to the issue of slavery and democracy and their relationship in the ancient Greek polis, the central notions that went with the notion of citizenship or the role of citizenship in the Greek polis, particularly in Athens, of course, which we know the most about. And these are isonomia, Izagoria, Illuteria, and Isotes. And I will say a bit about isonomia first, to which I will return at the end. So Herodotus, the famed Greek historian, suggested that the rule of the people has the fairest name of all equality, isonomia, and does none of the things that a monarch does. The lot determines offices, power is held accountable, and deliberation is conducted in public. So isonomia, of course, means same law, same rule, basically meaning rule of law is applied equally to all. This was a very central facet of Greek democracy. And of course, secondly, we have Izagoria, which can be defined as the freedom of speech. Agoria is, of course, the agora is a place where speech was conducted in public. And or later it was the pnyx, but first it was the agora. And P.J. Rhodes suggested that, in fact, the practice of Izagoria was limited, suggesting that the Athenian demos, for all its drive towards the right of every individual to full participation in the activity of government, accepted certain limits on the exercise of its political rights. The Athenians extended the use of the lot widely, for example, and they ensured rotation of offices by the one-year rule, but they exempted the strategia, that is, military leaders, from both. The people claimed Izagoria, but left its exercise to a few. Again, he suggests we must ask why. And one part of the answer, suggests Rhodes, is that the demos recognized the instrumental role of political rights and were more concerned in the end with the substantive decisions, where were content with their power to direct those decisions through their power to select, dismiss, and punish their political leaders. On this course, says Rhodes, they were favored by an important and genuine equality of the vote. Wherever there was a popular assembly in Greece, the principle of one man, one vote prevailed. There was no weighted group voting as in the Roman Centuriate Assembly, for example, or in the French States General. And then lastly, we have Illuteria and Isotes. Eleutheria actually is a very archaic term that can be compared to the modern concept of liberty and was often associated with the goddess of Artemis. And Isotes can be roughly translated to fairness. However, P.J. Rhodes actually argues that amongst these concepts, by far the most important was isonomia. And he says, if any one term is to be singled out as the banner of the ultimately victorious democracy, it is the word isonomia, which has two distinct connotations, he says. The dominant one is equality through the law, virtually synonymous for democracy, and therefore regularly employed in the context of political rights. But the other sense, equality before the law, takes us into a different sphere of behavior. With written law, says Theseus in the Suppliant Women of Euripides, people of few resources and the rich both have the same recourse to justice. Now a man of means, if badly spoken of, will have no better standing than the weak. And if the lesser is in the right, he wins against the great. So we have to remind ourselves of this reform of Solon, where even the poor could take grievances before a court of law, which, again, before the reforms of Solon was not possible. And of course, these rights were extended and deepened in practice, as well as formally throughout the generations, with Kleisthen making significant reforms as well to the demographic structures. And in fact, the word demography derives from this concept of deme that Kleisthen formalized. And of course, that's also related to demos and democracy. The boldness and rarity of such notions, suggests Rhodes, cannot be overstressed. The Roman of the Republic never attained it, never seriously desired to. The Roman emperors openly rejected it. There is no reason in principle why an oligarchy should not accept equality before the law in private relations. And there's evidence to suggest that some Greek oligarchies in fact did. Then, with the demise of the independent Greek polis, the Western world had to wait until recent times before the doctrine was reasserted and reintroduced. And modern experience, including our own, has shown that there is no principle more difficult to translate fully into practice than. On the other hand, we have the rise of democratic institutions along with those of slavery. Kafel argues that the Greeks, in fact, did not like to do things, that the evolution of the democratic order also saw a changing position of labor and laborers, including artisans and therefore slaves. So he continues that those tasks necessary to sustain life and to make it pleasant were regarded as a form of bondage precisely because of the necessity involved. Those things which gave pleasure were to be enjoyed, but pleasure was not expected to be found in employing the skill or technique needed to make beautiful objects or music. Thus, workmen could not be praised, for theirs was a mean occupation. Artisan and freeman was another near contradiction in terms. Although the artisan lacks a master, he is nevertheless subject to a limited servitude, doing for hire or for the state what the slave does for the master. The ideal life is one completely free of menial duties. Freedom meant to do what one wanted. The slave was not only did those things which free men did not want to do, but he did them under constraint because he had no choice. The occupation merited the character, and the character the occupation. And in fact, there was an increasing availability of slave labor, and that led to a static view of slaves. Work of any sort went in status from onerous, but not dishonorable tasks, from irritating but required inconveniences to slavish and base occupations. As more and more slaves became available, they performed more and more varied jobs. The low opinion in which slaves were held was extended to the work done by them. Thus, freedom became increasingly tied to and stood in opposition to slavery. There was an identification with the slave with the master and the master with the slave, in a sense that is very reminiscent of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. However, there is a qualitative difference in the perspective on slaves between classical Greece and Rome, which I will get to in a later lecture. So there is also the notion of the agonic. This was an important category for Nietzsche, for Jakob Burckhardt, the scholar of the Renaissance, and for many others. Says Owen, in Nietzsche's conception of freedom, the praxis of practice forms the agent through the development of the individual's powers to engage in and realize the goods of the practice in question, to enable the individual to overcome obstacles and resistances to mastery of the practice that are internal to participation in the practice, for example, the cultivation of the skills required, and at the same time, the development of their power to engage in the self-directed exercise of one's powers, i.e. to be able to overcome obstacles and resistances to mastery of the practice that are internal to one's own current constitution as an agent. So this concept, which I'll return to in later lectures, I find a very interesting concept to juxtapose with the modern conception in economics of competition, because the agonic does not necessarily oppose individuals against each other, but also against themselves in overcoming. Thus, the exemplary figure of the sovereign individual is tantamount to what is often referred to under the agonic. The human being, as Nietzsche suggests, with his own independent long will, and the human being who is permitted to promise. One cannot promise something if one does not anticipate being able to complete the task in the future, if one is not sovereign. So the sovereign individual is autonomous precisely because he's able and disposed to set his own ends as challenges to overcome and to bind his will to the task of realizing these ends as meeting these challenges. Hannah Arendt, of course, also focused on the agonic, saw it as a notion that was imbued with politics, or politics actually as an act of the agonic, which she saw similarly as Wittgenstein with his notion of language games. Now, lastly, in this lecture, I wanted to go over the notion of the importance of the military aspects of Athenian society and the development of democracy there. So one did see an element of solidarity that was cross-class in Athenian society. There was a central aspect to the role of military in the rise and spread of democracy and its maintenance as well. This would appear that almost always after the 8th century BCE, those residents of the Greek city-states who qualified by both birth and property as full citizens organized themselves for battle as hoplite infantry in the phalanx, a mass formation of heavy armored equals who fought on the agricultural land. However, there is a type of agrarian solidarity that Hansen speaks of, and he cites Aristotle, that the men who have fought and who fight have the most power, and those who possess the arms are the citizen. Hansen speaks of the ambiguous status of the hoplites, sometimes lumped in with the wealthy, and sometimes taking part in uprisings of the landless. The role of colonization is also very interesting in this respect. Suggests Ober that in colonization schemes, the wealthy were often expressly excluded, the state emphasizing that it was the Zygatai and the Thetes who needed sole opportunity to win new land. So this is what Hansen calls a type of trickle-up economics. And thus he suggests that the empire hastened the democratization process begun by Kleisthenes. It enhanced the status of social groups that held no land, providing jobs for more than 20,000 citizens outside agriculture. He continues, nevertheless, the hoplites also gained from democracy. The new self-interested Athenian hoplite wanted psychological security of keeping foreign armies off his farm without the need to march out to meet the aggressor in a pitched battle. To a large extent, the democracy through roads, forts, rural patrols, and the garrisons granted him his wish. Hansen suggests that the introduction of pay for hoplites, probably around the mid-5th century, was no doubt welcomed by Athenian farmers themselves, who in the twilight of the old agrarianism were discovering the attractions democracy had to offer. Moreover, economically speaking, generous polis entitlements to others, for instance, pay, could only expand the economy. These trickle-up economics enhanced the assets of those who were not poor to begin with. Athenian expansionism then was not a zero-sum format where someone's gain was another's loss, but rather an inflationary and expansionary process that actually benefited most people involved with it. On the bottom left here, we do see a trireme, the typical boat of the Athenians at the time. And you do see how it could be possible that a city like Athens would need 20,000 rowers. Feats, of course, the name of the naval sailors also was meant actually literally day wage earners, so people who were paid by the day rate. So I'll continue with the developments or counter developments in Rome in the next video.
Equality before the law.